when I was in prison, effectively, there was so many things that my mum said to me when I was a little boy that started to come back and started to have real relevance. And in a lot of cases, I actually understood finally what she was talking about.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today's guests, Ruth McFarlane and Dan White, are business partners and co-founders of the social enterprise Doing What Really Matters, which has the aim of significantly improving access to higher education for people in prison. I'm not going to give you long introductions because in a way I think your stories are integral to how Doing What Really Matters got started. So just really like to give you both a warm welcome and thanks very much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Dan and Ruth. Thanks very much for coming along to meet with us today. Perhaps we could start by you telling us a bit more about Doing What Really Matters, that organisation that you've started, and what the organisation aims to do and why there is a need for it.
DWRM is, we usually use our acronym, which is for our initials as well as conveniently for our sort of strapline of Doing What Really Matters. What we're really aiming to do is to create a much greater culture of acceptance across a whole range of institutions, universities, within prisons, but also society in general, by giving opportunities for people to demonstrate that they can participate fully in society once they leave prison, by creating opportunities for people to engage in education when previously they might have been excluded or not catered for, and for people to have high aspirations and goals and meaningful careers.
Yeah, and also from probably from a self-change point of view, it doesn't matter how many offending behaviour programs or courses or how much time a person may serve in prison. Self-change is, as it says itself, is self-change. And, the most effective way, the most complete way for a person to engage in that self-change process is to be able to shed the person they thought they were, the person they see themselves as, the person other people see themselves as, the labels they've been given and carried for any number of years, and to really affect their own attitudes and beliefs, and effectively then as a result their behaviour. That is all part of that self-change process. And what I really realised, what we've come to really understand and realise, is that self-change process has to be linked to or based on something substantial, something that takes time, effort, willpower, resilience, all of these factors to be able to create that change, that complete self-change. Now, one of the, we would think one of the most obvious tools. However, we've come to realize that it is, it's not so obvious, at least not for those who are engaged in, running prisons, keeping the public safe, etc., etc. The most obvious route to that is something that someone can be proud of, something that they can actually hang a whole identity on. And these are different forms of education and training, effectively.
That's great, but just to make sure I've really got a grasp, so is what you're doing, I know this is an overused cliche these days, are you building and providing pathways? Is that the sort of thing?
That's exactly right. As I said, again, that self-change process is something that you have to walk yourself. So, for it to have any kind of effect, it has to be something that is done by the individual themselves. So handing people things, giving people, handing people a new life, or handing someone any amount of money or whatever that may be, opportunities is one thing. But for it to actually, take hold of the individual, for it to actually have some real depth of meaning and relevance in that person's life, it has to be something that they do themselves, and that is walking that path. But if no path exists, then they're effectively beating their way through a forest. So what we want to do is create a pathway for people to walk themselves.
And the way that we're doing that effectively is we partner with universities and other education institutions to offer their courses to people in prison on a distance learning basis. And we talk a bit more about how that actually works. And so we are sort of like the bridge really between the institution and the student. So we provide some of the admin support. We also provide a lot of that study skills support to people through a whole range of means. And then when people are released from prison, we support that transition either to continue with their studies or into a career pathway. And so we offer sort of ongoing mentoring, coaching, advocacy support for people when they're released so that they can complete that qualification, have, as we've said, high career aspirations and achieve those goals.
So,
sorry.
No, carry on.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, for the sake of listeners who might not be all that familiar with what happens traditionally in education in prisons, how does what you're aiming to do differ from that? Why was there a need for your organisation in particular?
So the core provision in prisons is really quite limited, the education provision. It's focused at levels 1 and 2, which means it's equivalent to sort of GCSE type level, age 16. There's a very limited provision of maths, English, education for speakers of another language, and IT, but the IT provision is very outdated, I think it's fair to say. And there's some limited vocational training that is dependent on the specific requirements of each individual prison population. So really, beyond your sort of maths and English functional skills, there isn't really very much more available. As I say, there might be a little bit depending on what that particular prison education department offers, what the governor might choose, but certainly in terms of progression to what we call further and higher education, college and university, there's really very little on offer.
So how did you become aware of this need? Is it just obvious to somebody like you?
Well, I suppose it's a bit of a misnomer to say it's obvious to some. It's obvious because of the places in which we've both come from effectively. So for me, a person with lived experience of the criminal justice system, extensive lived experience, I can't even call it a pathway. I had to forge my way through, and whilst doing so, I started to notice the inherent changes within myself, within my thinking, within my attitudes and beliefs, which were effectively a fortunate byproduct because they weren't the intention. I didn't start my educational journey, with the intention of changing myself. I didn't really see, I don't suppose anyone who really sees how they're supposed to change their thinking and attitudes, etc. But it was something that just started to happen naturally as the further down that journey I got. And it was based on not just the study in itself, but all the barriers and the obstacles and the difficulties that came along with it that, helped to build my resilience, because I'm an entirely focused and determined individual when I'm on the right kind of path or seeking the right kind of outcome. And so once I decided that I wanted to achieve something educationally, then, you know, all of these other attributes came along with it, effectively.
And for me, I'm a teacher. I've always worked in sort of supporting people who are not well provided for by mainstream education. So I've worked in pupil referral units, I've worked with children in care, children excluded from school, I've taught in prisons. And it really, for me, it's always been a case that I think that there's a lot of people who don't fit the box of mainstream education and who are not included, not well catered for. And so really this is a sort of an extension of that. It's about trying to tap into people's intellect and abilities and create a sense of belonging and really kind of develop those study skills. And, you know, Dan's a classic example of somebody who's gone on to achieve fantastic things in spite of, rather than because of the support that he's had.
So yeah, and this is where our paths started to cross and align effectively, because as Ruth quite rightly said, you know, in hindsight, I was quite a bright student in school in my the early part of my schooling years. However, school was not a very hospitable place. You know, my school years were unhappy, which I suppose is a lot of people's stories. But yeah, I was in a school with a massive class size. We had a lot of teachers that weren't very motivated, shall we say, to engage their students. It was either he was involved or he wasn't, and because of that, I ended up leaving school. In fact, was excluded from school, and then left. So it was only once I'd reached a place that I did. You know, once I came into contact with the criminal justice system, that I decided to start that educational journey again. And as I said before, once I had started to reignite my love of studying, of education, of learning effectively, that also became something that I started to look around me and see that spark in certain others, but because of the difficulties that they would face just trying to get onto educational courses and whatnot. But I always seem to be able to see a solution or a way to be able to achieve what I wanted to do. So I started to feel that kind of sense of responsibility where I would always give, of my knowledge or of my experience to others around me, or, effectively try to help them to get onto whatever they wanted to do, or help them to complete, or to, start to plug the gaps effectively of the study skills that they needed and weren't receiving. So
really, in an informal way, you've been running this business sort of, without it being recognised as a business, but Dan's been doing this work for many years, having recognised that need. And what we've been doing over the last few years is formalising that into a social enterprise, and with more of a, kind of defined scope, and making it a business effectively. So
it sounds like a very brave venture for the pair of you to have embarked upon, really. I mean, did it seem to be brave for you? Did you recognise that there might be some difficulties and pitfalls along the way?
Well, I mean, as I've said a couple of times already, for me, I'm quite a determined I'm a very determined, in fact, can be quite dogged in my approach. When I know something's right and worth doing, then I will always stick at it. I've never been a person to see challenges and obstacles as problems or walls or blockages, just the next, effectively the next challenge that I need to overcome effectively, or, I will always find a route too. So for the inception of DWRM, it was something that was done out of necessity, and so therefore it wasn't really a case of me, or us being worried or scared. It was a case of we just determined to get it done because of the need for it.
I think from my perspective, I think, there were quite a lot of questions about what on earth was I doing. And I'm not a big risk taker by nature. And certainly I'd never run a business before. And to be setting up a business with my co-director being somebody who at that time was still serving a sentence, it was met with some questions and suspicion. And, but we kind of just took it day by day, step by step, worked through our business plan. We spent a lot of time discussing what did this look like, what were our values, what do we want to achieve in the long term. We always had a very clear sight of our long-term goal. So sort of through to incorporating our social enterprise, which was almost 2 years ago, that was very much in partnership. We then had a sort of a hiatus period where I was kind of running the business because Dan was gearing up for release but wasn't quite out. And then in the year plus since he's been released, we've been running it very much as a partnership. And I think we feel like we've really established a very strong basis for that partnership. And, proof's in the pudding. We're cracking on and we're growing and we're really ambitious.
So I still think it sounds very adventurous on two counts, at least, because you've mentioned how the prison service education system really was focused on levels 1 and 2, which incidentally, I worked in a specialist unit for men with learning difficulties. So even that was a problem, since the system was quite obsessional. They should achieve level 2, even though it was well beyond some of them. So there was that, as I'm suggesting, that kind of obsession with that kind of education. So you're suggesting something quite different. And then you've just mentioned suspicion, that you were working with Dan, who wasn't at that point released, and the prison authorities, I imagine, became suspicious. Did they?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, understandably, I suppose from the outside looking in, without knowing me, or without knowing too much details about, who I was or who I am as a person, it would, I suppose, it would be looked at like, why would you be entering into a business with someone who didn't even have, the liberty to sign a check, for example, at that period in time. But then, you see, this is where you can see why Ruth is my co-director and why we are engaged in what we are engaged in this business, because this is about having faith and being able to see the potential, the abilities, the capabilities of people who the rest of society have written off effectively. This is what gives Ruth that special kind of insight, that special kind of something that I don't even think there's a name for it. It's quite unquantifiable, to be fair, but it is entirely apparent in her day to day and in her personality that she has something about her that enables her to see just a person and not all the social constructs that we as society see first and foremost about people.
And I think for me, it's part of a kind of it's a genuine commitment to equality, and I hope that our partnership is demonstrating that.
Just while you're thinking, I can really hear Dan's appreciation of the fact that that you, Ruth, were able to see good in him and see his potential, and that's one of the themes that has regularly cropped up on the podcast. That for people with lived experience, somebody noticing their value and worth and having belief and instilling that belief in them that they could achieve something, and how important that is.
Yeah, well, I've just remembered the other thing I was going to say. Sorry. So firstly, it's part of a genuine commitment to equality, which I think is demonstrated in our partnership. But it's also about recognising that what we each bring to the partnership makes, it's like the whole being greater than the individual parts. And so we each inspire things in each other. So it's not just about me recognizing something in Dan, it's about him recognizing something in me as well. And so it's, it's not just me saying, oh, look, you could do really well. I recognize that ability in lots of people. And part of what we do as an organization is to bring people on and encourage and motivate and employ them. That's part of our commitment from our business. But it's recognizing kind of that magic that you get when there's a spark between two characters. And obviously we're from very different backgrounds, but we share so many of the same values, interests. We both did the same degree. We wrote our dissertations on the same topic without having known each other. We discovered this much later down the line, but we have a really shared academic interest, a shared belief system, in spite of our very different backgrounds. And I think we could see that in each other, and we could see the extra that would be created if we had this partnership going.
It wasn't about Ruth seeing good in me per se. It was more about her recognizing that here was someone with, a natural ability to be able to do what, hundreds of thousands of people out there try and fail every day. People start businesses all the time. And, as much as you may think about a person, outside who you may decide to partner with and start a business with, unless you both come from a similar background, or you've seen that person run a business before, then you're taking the same risk effectively. You don't know whether that person that you decide to risk your livelihood with and, your future and whatnot with, you're never going to know whether that person's actually able to, to be able to manage, to be able to make it work, to be able to overcome any difficulties and, rise to the occasion effectively. So, when you... weirdly enough, somebody who has had, contact with a criminal justice system, you're talking about someone who effectively you would know so much more about than anyone else that you'd know outside on the street, because, everything's documented, every part, all the negatives, all the pluses, they're all there for everyone to see. So, and then I suppose, it was quite obvious to Ruth to be able to see what I was able to do, considering what I had already done, in so much more difficult and challenging circumstances than, what you would usually encounter. So being able to, it's quite obvious that, well, this is someone who's been able to achieve X, Y, and Z despite being, in the situation that he was in. So I suppose that would give you a lot more confidence that when it comes to starting and running a business, this would be someone who would be a lot more capable of doing so.
But also from a rational business perspective, we play to our strengths. Dan brings a very different set of skills to me, and we absolutely maximise on that. We know that I'm good at the lists of the organising, and he's good at the sales pitchy stuff. And but equally, when we get together, the dynamic of what we achieve is really exciting. And I think that's part of the sort of the adventure of running a business, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that certainly comes across, the chemistry between you in terms of creating something that's much bigger than each of you individually. And certainly I wasn't meaning to imply that you're a charity case, Dan, that was being taken on, but it's more about the perspectives that wider society has towards people in prison. And clearly, what comes across is your drive and determination, and being a significant factor in the partnership as well. So sorry if it sounded like I was saying you were not carrying an equal weight within the relationship.
That's right. Thank you.
So have you got a good working relationship with the prison service now?
Again, this is one of those things that my good relationship with the prison services in one aspect has been able to transition into good working relationships, as a business owner now. When I was in prison, effectively, there was so many things that my mum said to me when I was a little boy that started to come back and started to have real relevance. And in a lot of cases, I actually understood finally what she was talking about. When simple things like having good values and good morals and principles, and being polite and carrying yourself well. She was used to say to me, "You never know who's watching." So that the way I carried myself whilst I was completing that sentence, obviously, translated into individual establishments and the senior management teams that ran them, being really receptive to what I was approaching them with effectively, because I carried myself well while I was there. They saw the work ethic I had in one respect, so that was it was easily transferable in another. So that was a very good start. And then obviously Ruth having her side and working with prisons, in an educational sense for many years previously. So combined, we'd already had a multitude of very good, relationships with a lot of their prison estates. So, the rest started to just show as we started to grow.
What we're really finding is, and Dan probably wouldn't say this himself, but partly he just has an ability to engage and get on with people from all backgrounds. So like when he goes into prison now on visits, and he started doing that remarkably quickly after being released, which I was a bit anxious about, but he was like, no, I'm going to do this. He can talk to the governor at a strategic level because he understands what the governor's priorities are. He can talk to the education manager about sort of day-to-day stuff and what sort of barriers and things might be in place, what support might be required. And of course, he can talk to the men and women on the wings about his own personal experience. And that is proving to be sort of invaluable, really, that sort of personal interaction. So when he is going into prisons and talking about what we're wanting to achieve, it's kind of quite an easy sell, really, because of his ability to engage in this way and to recognize what people's priorities are, what are their goals, what are their concerns. He anticipates things well, and that's what he's always done. He thinks, he's a deep thinker, and he's always thought a lot about what might happen, and he plans for it. And so, yeah, in terms of it's
Thanks. And I really liked your example there, Dan, of how things can lodge in the mind, in your case, from your mum, and come to the surface maybe years later as you develop some greater understanding of that comment and that context.
Exactly right.
Naomi.
Yeah, is there any cut-off in terms of whereabouts in someone's sentence they are for you to take them on? Do they need to be at a certain point in their sentence, or do you take people at all stages?
Well, look, see, this is something that I know that you're probably going to ask about, the funding which links to this. So I'm going to kind of answer both questions.
Sure, yeah.
So there is no point, there's no cut-off point, there is no starting point apart from where that person wishes to start from. You can't, we're not turning anybody away. That's just one of the things that we decided that, from the very, very beginning, that at the end of the day, we weren't going to, make our population smaller than the prison population. Our population is as big as the prison population, effectively. So there's real practical challenges, obstacles and barriers to us, working in this way effectively. And one of those, which is a major issue, is the issue of funding. So as we all know, we're not handing people free, educational courses and degrees and whatnot, because we're just not in a position to do so. I'd love to be able to, but that's not the case. So, students in prison, which is something that I'm not sure many people seem to really understand or even know, is that, people have to apply for student loans and funding like anybody else out here who can't afford to just self-fund. The issue with that, and, it makes absolutely no sense, to be fair. But the issue that's in place is there's a point at which, you know, somebody with infinite wisdom has decided is the point at which somebody in prison can be able to apply for a student loan at, which is a 6-year point. However,
you mean 6 years before the
6 years
to be within 6 years
in,
of release?
In actual, they have to be within 6 years of release date and or a parole date to be able to successfully apply for student funding, for a student loan, which makes no sense.
Well,
it makes no sense in this respect.
Yes.
So there's multitudes of research that, you know, we look at reoffending rates, we look at the things that cut those reoffending rates, that exacerbate those reoffending rates, and then we look at the different sentence lengths, and, you know, the different sentence lengths and their relation to reoffending. So one fact of that is that those with longer sentences generally tend to reoffend a lot less. Now, if you've got a long sentence to complete, however, if, you know, these are people with long sentences, they was given long sentences because they were engaged in a much more serious type of offending. So that in itself tells you that if that person reoffends, then it's going to be a lot more serious than someone with a short sentence. So you would think that you'd want to ensure that those people are the people that you not necessarily focus on, but ensure that they are not reoffending, because they're going to create victims, create a lot of harm, a lot of damage, you know, in a lot of cases. So engaging someone in something long-term throughout their long-term sentence, you would think you would enable these people to be able to study, you know, take on a student loan. Now, I know there's practical reasons why, but at the end of the day, you know, you could means test it against, you know, what it costs to keep someone in prison for these amount of years, and effectively how much it would cost if they were to reoffend. That alone, that figure alone, the amount of time that a person's in prison is already done. But if you look at the potential for that person to reoffend, the type of offences that they would be committing, and everything that surrounds that, from, you know, the detection and arrest to the court process to them being resentenced, the amount of money that would cost versus allowing that person to take on a student loan, which, okay, we know a percentage won't pay back just due to, you know, life or not being able to get employment or whatever that may be, but a large percentage of that will be repaying those loans. So, and even for that money lost against what it would cost to keep them in prison for that amount of time, you would think it would, you know, it's a no-brainer, effectively.
The logic behind the 6-year rule is that it should take about 6 years to complete a part-time degree, and that once people complete, they need to be in a position to get a job and, you know, potentially start repaying their loan. There was some modelling done 2 or 3 years ago, which showed that actually, as Dan has said, the benefits, if somebody on a long sentence was able to start studying much earlier, partly they've got the potential to progress through undergraduate and potentially some postgraduate study as well. But that also, because of the known reduction in reoffending rates, there would be a massive net benefit to the public purse, even if people never actually repaid their student loans. The cost of them not going back to prison is so beneficial in so many ways, not just the financial cost, but the benefits to society in terms of, you know, reduced harm and reduced numbers of victims. But unfortunately, because it's one pot of money is from Ministry of Justice and student loans come out of Department for Education budget, it's about trying to join up all of those conversations. And there's a lot of organisations who are lobbying to get that changed, who recognise the significant benefits that this would bring.
Yeah,
we're definitely one of them.
Yeah, oh, definitely, yeah. And, you know, just to compound that, you know, we've got stats that, you know, because we know everybody loves a stat. But, you know, if you just look at the general reoffending rate, which ranges from between 48 to 56% over between the 1 and 2 years after release, versus somebody who's completed an undergraduate degree whilst in prison, their reoffending rate is 6%. And even though the numbers are very small, and it's hard for them to get enough statistical evidence to really back it. But for postgraduate, the reoffending rate currently is at 0. So when you take those two stats, in comparison to the general reoffending rate,
we should be getting everybody to this level.
Exactly.
And what support do you provide to people in prison? What is it are you supporting them in finding a way to navigate that system, or do you provide other ways of supporting them?
Well, it's a whole cross section of support, effectively. So which ranges from us, first of all, forming those partnerships and creating the opportunities for them to be able to study. So, and then so effectively we've got to the point where, our potential students are picking up perspectives and seeing actual bricks and mortar universities' choice of study of subject area,
accredited courses.
The whole range. So they're seeing that. So that's the pathway created initially, and then on top of that, we would then provide advocacy where necessary. We will have one-on-one conversations with universities for individual students, helping them with study skills, providing access to their university providers, their education providers. Something that being part of, being able to study is one thing, but studying in isolation can be as difficult and as lonely and as depressing a journey as not studying at all and just sitting behind a door. Being part of a learning community, feeling connected to your university and to other students without ever actually physically seeing or maybe even speaking to them. But that's what these are the kind of things we provide so that our students feel actually part of, that and enjoying that study experience, as closely as, to the general population students as humanly possible within their circumstances.
So we're enabling sort of phone seminar sessions with tutors at designated times through use of our free phone number, so that we're not giving out any tutors' phone numbers or anything, but students are able to speak to a tutor, and we're providing lots of generic study skills. One of the other things that we want to come on and talk about is the technology that we're developing, or not that we're developing, but that we're supporting and enabling the provision of.
I mean, perhaps we could move on to that, because obviously people in prison are very much technologically deprived, aren't they? Even the staff, actually, the standards of what people are working with are below other sections of society. So when you're talking about the people who are actually living in prison, then...
So we know that it's a very risk-averse environment in prisons, that the security has meant that development of and use of technology has been very slow and very sort of backward. One of the good things that's come out of COVID really is a sort of quite a rapid adoption of some technology use in prisons, some of it better than others. But we're particularly working with a company called Coracle, who have for several years been developing secure Chromebook devices, which are offline, which have been through rigorous testing and met all the security requirements, and which we're now able to be providing to our students so that they can have access to university study materials, recorded lectures, readings, and so on, which they can use in their own cell.
And there's a lot of benefits to this. Students being able to study in this way. None other than, as I said, this study experience in itself. But there's other practical reasons as well. I mean, the idea is to make this as easy for everybody concerned as possible. That is the establishments themselves, the prisons themselves, prison staff, and the prisoners, our students who are in prison as well. So effectively, them being able to be able to study in this way means that they have to carry less books. That means less work for prison staff having to, enable these things to be posted in, sent in, handed in, being checked. When prisoners are moving from wing to wing or prison to prison, that means they have less to carry. That means less stuff that has to be moved about. as there's restrictions on the amount of property that a prisoner can take on a prison bus with him, for example, when we're looking at an individual's personal property, we're going from, realistically, their clothes, their property, those things are most valuable to them. And as important as studying may be, when someone's got a whole bag full of books that weighs about 30, 40 kilos, they're not getting on a bus with me. And when they're faced with a choice of, do I leave my clothes, my toiletries and my photographs and whatnot, or my books, they're going to choose the books every single time, which creates, these things practically just create more cost because they get sent on later, which all these things cost money. So if somebody's got 30, 40 kilos worth of book in a little Chromebook that weighs less than 5 kilos, then practically they're going to be able to move these things from place to place so much more easily. It's being more dynamic with the things that are available. And then on top of that, as we said before, that student is going to experience studying, it's such a beautiful design, the way in which they're laid out. So they're studying offline, but with an online feel. So when they're looking at their Chromebook, when they open it up and they're working through and everything's live, all their hotspots are live and whatnot, they could actually feel like they were studying online, like general population students, even though, we know and they know that they're not. So there's so many benefits to this arrangement. And then, it also enables the universities and all the other education providers to be able to, they're a lot more accessible when they need to send updates or, the next set of study materials or whatever that may be, that can just be done electronically within seconds instead of it taking weeks and things getting lost and, all of these things that are day-to-day occurrences within a prison.
And so people are developing their digital skills as well as their digital study skills, which is, again, a really important part of their transition on release, to be able to study in the community and at the universities.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about how much the world has changed in terms of technology, I think for anyone serving a long sentence, life's going to be pretty overwhelming getting out, just looking at the technology, isn't it? But as you were talking, I was also thinking about how there's potentially benefits to other, like the library services, for instance. Not everybody who's using a library is going to be necessarily wanting to study, but actually being able to have access books in that way, you could see that you're opening the doorway, pushing at things that have the potential to change the system in other ways further down the line. Dan, you're studying for a PhD. What are you focusing your research on?
Okay, so my PhD is in criminology. So again, the only reason why I'm able and really wanted to take on this PhD effectively was because the area is one that will hopefully again make things a lot easier for prison itself as a whole. So I'm all about solutions, as I'm sure I've said, and I'm sure that you've probably become aware of by now, but I'm also looking at, so within this area, I'm looking at the, certain barriers to people being able to effectively study. There is a whole tranche of people that go to prison, that are in prison currently, that have the capability and the ability to be able to study, you have the intellectual ability and all the other bits and pieces required for them to be able to study at a higher level, but yet there is something that stops them. So I effectively wanted to know what that was. And then I wanted everyone else to know what that was. So this is where, I focused my attention. So more specifically, I'm looking at early childhood trauma, or adverse childhood experiences, as they're more commonly and academically known. So the way in which adverse childhood experiences can inhibit a person's ability to study at a higher education level effectively.
That's really interesting, because I know from running groups where there was some psychoeducational material, just being in a group room having discussions often triggered for people uncomfortable feelings of being back in the school system, feeling like the stupid one in the class, feeling like a failure, and all of that could actually make participating in psychological therapy difficult because they're emotionally aroused as a consequence of these experiences from earlier on. So yeah, I'm sure there'll be a lot of value, and hopefully when you're further down the line with your PhD, you'll be able to come back and talk to us about your research.
Yeah, definitely.
So what's next on the cards for DWRM?
Well, I mean, I think we're all about these cultures of acceptance. So our university partners, we're already starting to see the benefits of the engagement that we've had and the discussions in terms of barriers to admissions or pastoral care and the other support. There's a lot of really good conversations starting to happen now. We really want to embed that. Not just in the universities, in the prisons as well. And in fact, probably more importantly, in the prisons, that there's a real lack of aspiration for people who are in prison, but also there's a sense that people in prison don't really deserve to have good outcomes. And so we want to be challenging that idea by giving people an opportunity to demonstrate success. And of course, we've talked about how Dan's proof of that, but there's lots of other people who we work with who are proof of that. And we want to be challenging that culture.
Yeah, definitely. You see, there is a negative culture within prison. I mean, prison has, three main purposes, effectively, which are punishment, public protection, and rehabilitation. So we know that they do the first two very well. Yeah, when the person's in prison, the public are safe. We know prison is not a nice place, and all the restrictions and the things that someone doesn't have when it's in prison effectively forms that part of the punishment, and the length of time that they are subject to that ensures two parts. The third part, the rehabilitative part, that is where the prison service is severely lacking. And it's lacking not necessarily in its ability or its capabilities to do so, but I feel like it's more in terms of, the lack of motivation, and in terms of, as Ruth quite rightly said, this attitude that some are deserving and some are not. So it's about changing that culture, because, purely on a selfish level, society thinking on a selfish level, we're a lot more effective if we produce, what effectively I want is for people like myself to be the norm, not the exception. Yeah. Because this is the way in which we create real change. This is the way we really impact that reducing reoffending attitude and need that we have within this society. So embedding, changing the cultures so that the prison service as a whole focuses on the rehabilitative side, so that, okay, there's not a lot we can do once a person's already offended. They've done that. That's happened. But what happens after that? And, do we want to perpetuate, as you said yourself now, when going through certain programs, old negative feelings are, they're brought back up, they're brought to the surface, some that are buried in, but these are constant within these individuals. So instead of perpetuating those negative feelings, let's deal with the fact that these are, at least in part, the cause for a lot of the offending that takes place. So let's address that. Let's change that. We're not talking about handing people anything, giving them, exactly. We're not talking about that. We're talking about giving people the opportunity to make those necessary changes. And that can only be done by, you can't pay lip service to it. You have to actually believe it and fully support it. So changing that culture within the prison system first and foremost. And then, as Ruth said, creating a much wider culture of acceptance within the education institutions themselves. And then thirdly, and I feel like most importantly, because as I started with, this self-change process, giving people who've never had the belief that they can do any different. Most of the time they people think that people in prison think that I'm here now, this is the life that I've found myself in and there's no way out. so I might as well keep doing what I was doing because nobody's ever going to let me do anything different. Well, I want to change those beliefs. I want to change those attitudes. I want to change them to the point where people are understanding that if I do make the effort, if I do complete what I start, then people will accept me as someone different because I am somebody different. You know, they're able to change that identity and be accepted, that new identity, be accepted in our society, be accepted within these different communities, whether it be an academic community, whether it be within the workplace, you know, or generally just out on the street, so that people can understand that they can be of benefit. You know, I want, as I said, my experiences like my own. You know, I do a lot of public speaking, and I do so from, you know, the point of view of a learned and lived experience expert, because I've lived these experiences and I've learned them. However, I want that marketplace to be saturated, whereby so many people have that lived and learned experience. So they're coming out, you know, and are able to like I said, I want it to become the norm, not the exception. And
a growing community of academics who can contribute to policy reform and to research from that background of that lived experience, but who are, you know, not there on a tokenistic basis, just being consulted in a focus group, but who are genuinely running that research or, you know, writing those policies. And we are starting to see that. And we want, you know, we want that to really grow and become the norm.
You can really hear how much education has played a role for both of you, actually, in terms of being something that's nourishing for you. But just as we wrap up the interview, are there other things that keep you feeling healthy enough to cope with some of the challenges of running a business like this?
Well, for me, myself, I mean, you know, I'm probably going to live on the high of being free for a lot of more years to come. So that does it. But then, you know, what happened, taking the most joy out of the simple pleasures in life. You know, I have two beautiful boys that I call them boys. They're big men, bigger than me now. you know, having my kids around me, being able to have a real effect on and in their lives is, you know, these are the things that they re-energize me. You know, they and then, to be fair, I take so much personal satisfaction when I see guys coming out of prison with new attitude, with, you know, that glimmer of hope, and being able to capture that and you know, enable that light to be brighter every day, that every time I see them, there's no replacement for that. That in itself is so emotionally charging. It will keep me going till the end of time, I think.
I think for both of us, families are, you know, a really big part of that support network. And I've got two sons who are also, you know, tall and hairy, but yeah, who, you know, give me great joy. And I suppose probably also for both of us, exercise is a vital part of, well, probably every day for Dan and 2 or 3 times a week for me, but, you know, in different forms. Yeah, doing exercise is a good head clearer. We often say, oh, I'm just going to need to go for a run and clear my head. So yeah, probably that's works for both of us, I'd say.
Thank you. That's been a really nice, positive, uplifting conversation. Actually, I really enjoyed hearing about that. And both of you, the passion for the work that you're doing really came across. That's lovely. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Passionate and inspirational. So many thanks.